Get in, loser! We are going to kill God!
Hi there, I'm Nevakanezah. You may remember me from such films as Gittin Gud, A Marquis to Cat Guide, and... In fact, let's not discuss those other films. If you're watching this video, then you're an intermediate player who's tired of watching opponents topple your carefully built house of cards, and are looking to crush your friends with one of the most powerful factions in all of Root. While I may not be a certified ornithologist, I'm here to answer all the questions you may have, such as, how do I wrap my head around this faction? Why can't I stop turmoiling? And, sir, please stop bothering the owl. Without further ado, let's begin. It took quite a while to write this guide, and the reason for that is that the Eyrie game plan isn't one you can break down into nice, easy pieces. Unlike the cats whose strategy follows a consistent beginning, middle, and end, the exponential growth of the Eyrie can be guided only by your own careful decision-making. Playing the birds is more like riding a shopping cart down a large hill. You start out slow and shaky, and you try to go as fast as you can without swerving into oncoming traffic. Mastering this faction means riding our shopping cart as fast as we can for as long as we can, and being prepared to recover if things do go south. This means planning a winning strategy based on our opponents. This means picking the right leader and stabilizing our decree as quickly as possible. This means having the patience to build our decree right and not invite disaster. This means maintaining enough roosts to outscore our opponents. And finally, this means stacking our decree up to the absolute limits of what our fragile simian brains can handle and maintaining it there, so that our outrageous scoring and action economy can ride us to the finish line while dominating the entire board. The easiest place for us to start is with our leaders. Now, you already know what each leader does, but you may not be familiar with how they compare to each other competitively. The first thing you should know is that their viziers are often more important than their abilities. Better viziers means we need fewer bird cards to build an effective decree, but having better leader abilities is only helpful if we can build a decree that takes advantage of them. Good viziers can outweigh a lackluster ability, but a great ability can't make up for bad viziers. The best leaders have a vizier setup that directly supports a powerful ability. With that out of the way, let's run through the leaders from worst to best, starting with Commander. He has the worst viziers of all, bar none. In order to make use of his ability, we need several bird cards in Recruit, and at least one each in Battle and Build. Instead, we only get Move and Battle from this leader. He struggles to sustain his warrior count, takes forever to start his scoring engine, and takes even longer to have enough battles to be worthwhile. Plus, his powerful ability scares your opponents, who all know that you can't deal any extra hits if you're dead. He's the most useful when you've turmoiled right near the finish line with a lot of warriors on the board, and you really need to kill the hell out of something to win the game. Next up is the Builder. He has weak viziers, because Recruit and Move aren't bad, but they don't accomplish much on their own. How are you going to craft without a card in Build? His ability to unlock our powerful crafting is tempting, but the birds have weak card draw compared to other factions, and can only craft cards when they have a choice of what to put in the decree each turn. You could pray that your card RNG outweighs the Builder's bad viziers, or you could just play the Despot and have better viziers and an ability that pays off every time. Next up is the Despot, who has the safest combination of viziers of any leader. You can add cards to Recruit as you spread across the board. You love free cardboard as the Despot, and you're a nightmare in games against insurgent factions like the Otters, Crows, Woodland Alliance, and Warlord. The extra VP from this ability adds up very quickly when combined with all the roosts you've been putting down. Sadly, you have to build your recruitment from the ground up, which can take a lot of time. You're very hard to turmoil if you build it solidly, but keeping you confined to only a couple clearings is much easier than it sounds. Lastly is the Charismatic Leader. Recruit and Battle aren't impressive on their own, but the Charismatic's ability halves the number of recruiting cards you need. Your decree can become self-sufficient with only one bird card for build and suited cards in Move. Since you're able to sustain battles every turn, you're constantly oppressing your opponents. The downside is that if you don't battle enough every turn, you're going to turmoil on the earliest columns of your decree. The strongest leader by far, but also one of the hardest to play well. The Despot and Charismatic leaders are the best two by a wide margin, and a reliable Eyrie strategy makes use of one or both of these in some way. With our leader selected, it's time to start thinking about how we're going to make it through those first couple turns until our decree is able to stand up on its own. Whenever we start with a fresh leader, it means that we're not making full use of our decree. We want to reach a point where we can sustain an action from every column as soon as possible, or else we're just passing up opportunities every turn. However, we don't want to cause an unwanted turmoil by unbalancing our decree, as this would set us back to step 1. Each column in our decree comes with benefits and responsibilities that we need to balance against each other, and a decree that balances every column with as few cards as possible is what I'm going to call a Pareto-efficient decree. You can't make greater usage of any column without causing a trade-off in effectiveness somewhere else. Ignore the move column. This concept can be a useful framework for prioritizing which columns to build first or preparing for turmoil. In a Pareto-efficient decree, we need enough recruiting to keep up with opponents, defend roosts, battle, and rule so that we can build. We need enough movement to reach our opponents and new clearings in which to build. We need enough battles that we're able to open new build sites, hamstring our opponents, and balance our recruiting, and most importantly, we want to build each turn at least once in order to score. Understanding how many bird cards you need in order to reach this situation can help inform which choice of leader is the most effective for this point in the game. We don't need to know too much about setup as the birds. Our starting hand matters far more to us than our starting position. Most of the time, though, we want a suited card matching our starting clearing so that we can move out, and as many bird cards as we can get. Advanced setup allows us to draft our hand to suit our needs, which makes No-turmoil Strategies much more consistent because they usually require at least one bird card. Because the Eyrie sets up so far away from our opponents, our choice of starting clearing is often very limited. If we're allowed to set up first, it ensures that we can set up somewhere that works for the cards in our hand. If you're unlucky, opponents can force you to start in a cluster of like suits, and you just have to deal with turmoiling on turn 1 because of it. A bad starting hand means we may need to plan for turmoil with a disposable leader that allows us to move out of danger. Positionally though, all we really want is to set up somewhere where we won't turmoil in the first couple of turns, and sometimes next to an opponent that we want to bully really early. When it comes to turmoil, the ideal number of turmoils is either 0 or 1. You can be forced to turmoil, and you should be ready to deal with it if that happens, but you should never intend to do it yourself more than once. Consider it this way. If we compared each faction based on how many decree actions they perform each turn, most factions have about 7 or 8 actions per turn. Having more actions than our opponents gives us more control over the board than anyone else. Each time we turmoil, however, we lose that advantage and we have to rebuild it from the ground up. Worse still, the earlier we turmoil on our turn, the more actions we're forced to skip by turmoiling early, leading to even more wasted potential. When comparing a strategy that intentionally turmoils to one that doesn't, there's a few pros and cons to consider. For turmoil strategies, they help mitigate the weaknesses of the leader that you intend to finish the game with. They're easy to run, can be explosive in growth, and can help mitigate bad RNG in your starting hand. You want to turmoil very early, because our end goal is still to build a large stable decree. However, they sacrifice a lot of action economy in order to set up, and spend less time overall in a position of strength over the board. They draw a lot of attention, and the dip in momentum is a weakness opponents might exploit to undo your progress. And additionally, you might be throwing away a leader you really want to keep as a fallback if you ever turmoil again. For non-turmoil strategies, however, these are often frighteningly strong, with the action economy of potentially 2 or more factions every turn by the end of the game. They're very difficult to stop if you've built them well, and they're capable of outracing the board or crushing it beneath frequent battles. The problem is they're slow to get started and heavily reliant on bird cards to build the decree that can't be turmoiled. They're potentially very difficult to play well. The decree becomes unmanageable, you need to set up fallback options for battle and build, and each card that you add on your turns is a potential liability for each subsequent turn. And lastly, being forced to turmoil with one of these strategies is devastating, and usually occurs at the worst possible time. Onto the strategies themselves, the Eyrie is one of the few factions with a lot of very distinctive strategies, and we in the Root community love to invent fun names for them because we, like the pharaohs of old, crave eternal life. You may have tried running the Double Build Despot as a long-term strategy. It was initially conceived for putting your first 2 cards into move and build with the aim of racing ahead of the table as quickly as possible. Sustaining 2 builds is nigh impossible, especially against good opponents, and you spread yourself out too thinly for this to be viable long term. But learning how to handle multiple builds in your decree can be a valuable trick for turmoil strats or for leaping to the finish in other games. Next up is a strategy I'm calling Jimmy Carter. It's the Builder. That's the whole strategy. It's playable, but deeply suboptimal, because every now and again you do actually get to draw enough crafting to make this approach worthwhile. Next up is a strategy called the Orderly Despot. You've probably already played this, even if you've never heard of the name. You pick the Despot, you don't turmoil, and you start building up your recruiting with all the bird cards you can find. This strategy hits its stride when it can afford to battle and start eating cardboard. It takes you from slow and boring to 8 victory points a turn in a real big hurry. The strategy is very, very safe, but also very passive. Against aggressive opponents, it's going to suffer more. Lastly is the God of War. This is one of the strongest playstyles of any faction in the entire game. It's probably the most difficult one to play as well. I probably don't need to tell you why being able to battle is good in a war game, but this strategy does more of it than nearly anyone else. This strategy requires someone to battle on the first couple of turns in order to avoid turmoiling while you get set up, and it needs a bird card for build, ideally in your starting hand. You end up taking an early seat in the center of the board so that you have opponents within easy reach, and you build your battle and recruit columns based on how well those two columns are balancing each other out. If you're adding another card to the column and it would bring you dangerously close to turmoil on each subsequent turn, then stop building those columns and just keep the decree alive as long as you can. Spare cards that you have go into the move column to keep this decree alive when you don't want to put anything into the other columns. In addition to carefully managing your warrior supply, you want your battles to really hurt someone every single time in order to actually keep the table behind you. Next up is a strategy called Exploding Birds, whose initial conceit was to open with the charismatic leader, recruit as fast as you can, and then turmoil into Despot, possibly double build Despot, with a ton of warriors on the board. It aims to solve the Despot's recruiting issues with only a turn or two of setup, but sacrificing the charismatic leader for this is awful. It's good only if you know the table is not going to be able to punish you after the fact, or that you're going to have enough cardboard to justify this loss. Next up is a strategy that I like to call Imploding Birds. It's Exploding Birds, but in reverse. Also, it's better. You start with the double build Despot to skip the slower setup of Charismatic, and turmoil into Charismatic on turn 2 or 3 with a bunch of roosts and victory points to tide you over. It gives you additional cards to work with for setting up the Charismatic leader, and is a great workaround for when you want to play Charismatic, but your starting hand and position sucks. Next, let's talk about the decree. You already know what it does, but being able to control it is what separates a novice Eyrie player from a great Eyrie player. A great Eyrie player waits for bird cards rather than rushing their decree with suited cards in bad places. They leave little to no room for opponents to force a turmoil upon you. They can fulfill the requirements of their decree for a very long time, and they keep multiple options open to fulfill those columns on this and every subsequent turn. If you want to avoid an unwanted or forced turmoil, you need to build a strong decree. And the first rule to doing this is keeping the edges blue. No suited cards in recruit or build, and only in battle if opponents literally cannot vacate those clearings completely. You can avoid running out of roosts by leaving them unguarded, or building them where you know they're going to be destroyed, like on top of a mob token. If you do add suited cards to your decree, you want to make sure you're not doing it solely in pursuit of short-term interests, like chasing extra points or trying to police someone, especially in the mid-game, because this is going to be a problem for you on every subsequent turn. One thing you should never forget is your opponents want to turmoil you. They are constantly looking for ways to break your decree, and they will even go to lengths like sacrificing their own buildings to another player just to turmoil you on battle. You want to keep an eye on the table talk to know how desperate they are. You want to try to prevent anyone from having the resources to dramatically change the board state between your turns. And you want to review your own decree regularly for liabilities your opponents may be looking to capitalize on. Remember that any large point burst you accomplish is going to get people looking at your decree immediately. Next, we want to make sure we have fallback plans for everything we need to do on our turns. If you need to attack someone in order to build, you need to make sure that you're bringing enough birds to ensure that you can still build if you get ambushed. It's helpful to make sure that we rule another clearing in the event that we need to build in an emergency. We want to make sure that we can fulfill our remaining battles if we roll too well and there's no one else to fight in the one place we started. And we want to set up lone birds in a few clearings if we need to fulfill future battles in later turns. When it comes to fulfilling your decree, remember that your recruit and move actions need to set you up for battle and build, so look at the last two columns to decide where you need to be by the end of the first two. Now, as you might imagine, we have a pretty close relationship with cards. Here's a quick rundown of things the Eyrie should consider when choosing how to use those cards. First, if there's a Corvid player in your game, you can guess plots during your birdsong to avoid putting cards in your decree at all. Alternately, with only a small change in timing, you can plot guess to draw an emergency card, which you could then optionally guess again. There's a number of cards that help you build the decree. These are very helpful because if your hand is terrible, we love having ways to draw additional cards or to replace the ones we currently have. Next, cards that help us fulfill the decree. Any card that gives us extra movement is going to help us reach easier clearings to build or battle in. Cards that help us place warriors down are going to accomplish much the same, and cards like Tax Collector allow us to both draw cards and manage our recruitment. Next, there's a few powerful, potentially underappreciated cards for the birds that let you do some interesting things. Master Engravers allows you to double the crafting VP you receive for every item you craft. Scouting Party helps with the fact that we like to battle a lot, and the Royal Claim card is basically built for this faction to give you extra points that you didn't need. On the topic of crafting, we would be one of the best crafting factions were it not for disdain for trade and our middling card draw. But even though we may not get paid off very well for it, crafting items is still absolutely worthwhile for us, but mostly to deny these points to our opponents. Cards like the coins, hammer, and tea are often part of someone else's win condition, and each one of those 1 victory point crafts for you is potentially 3 victory points your opponents can no longer reach. Much like crafting, this notion of denial extends to our decree as well. Some cards would be enormously helpful to our opponents, and we don't want them circulating through the deck any more than they have to. If there's a card in your hand that you know an opponent would love to see circulate into the deck again, why not lock it in your decree for the next 5 turns? If you've followed my advice about patiently building a strong decree and staying ahead of the board in terms of action economy, then you've probably reached the endgame in a position of considerable power. Oftentimes, you'll be in a position where your roost scoring on this turn is just barely in reach of a win, and this can be an opportunity to do some crazy crap to win the game. With a big enough decree, the Eyrie can be completely board wiped and still accomplish an enormous amount of things on their turn, with enormous recruiting if you get board wiped, multiple builds if you can manage to rule, audacious battles to clean up extra cardboard. Everything is on the table if you're capable of winning on this turn or potentially the next one, so long as you can avoid turmoiling before you win. While this kind of bold strategy is great to close out a game, it doesn't mean that these plays are optimal. RNG could force you into a turmoil and throw the game for you. If opponents specifically don't have a win on their turn, why take the risk if you don't have to? Playing it safe can actually be more impressive to your opponents because you had the restraint to resist making greedy, desperate choices that would have lost you the game. Remember to read your opponent's turns carefully, figure out what they're capable of, and decide whether or not you need to try and race to the end of the game, or whether you have the time to play it safe. Use your turn to punish opponents who might be even the smallest threat to win on their turns, and close out the game in style. Because it is only through patience, careful planning, and actual, frustrating practice that we finally get good. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for the response to the cat video. You guys managed to hit the request of 100 likes in about 2 days, which I honestly should have expected. To give myself some space for other projects though, I'll probably start making the next video at about 200 likes. In the meanwhile though, I'll probably release some videos that require a lot less planning and editing, probably some guides on reading the board state. If you've got a specific faction or matchup you'd like me to look at first, leave me a comment, I'll get to work on it. This particular video took a long time to make though. Birds are a tough one to write for. Obviously, everyone tends to struggle with a different part of the faction, and once you get over turmoil, then usually you're a lot better off, and I can't really make a video that just says, get good at the faction. Just do it. The next guide would probably be a faction where the gap between beginners and experts is much easier to close, so hopefully I'll be able to finish it faster. Thanks again for showing up, and have a good one.